we've got lots of time for discussion at the end. So I'm looking forward to some questions and discussion at the end of the talk as well. Sorry, I just got to, oops, where are we? Oh, there we go. Get rid of that little message. So what I want to try and cover today is to, first of all, I want to talk just a little bit about meta theory and some broad themes of the approach that we take to this, the social identity approach, and to put that into context a little bit. Then I want to share some of our preliminary work that we've done on academic social identities and how that relates to learning approaches particularly. I want to talk a bit about the role of norms and how peer norms kind of impact upon this, something that we kind of often intuitively reflect on but don't necessarily study enough. And then I want to talk a bit about some other applications of these ideas. So we've done some work on identity incompatibility and ways in which that might undermine learning. I want to talk a bit about identities and feedback orientations. This is a fairly new area of research that's become, is I think quite important in higher education, is how students deal with feedback. So I want to talk about how it relates to that. And then some general implications and then time for discussion. So at the end, there's a number of other kind of areas in which we're exploring these variables, but there's not really time to look at them in detail today. So I list them at the end. And so if some of those other topics kind of also interest you, then of course you can feel free in the discussion to ask, and I can give you a little bit more detail about some of those. So first of all, in terms of thinking in terms of education research, I was thinking about where we fit in, I suppose, in terms of broad themes of educational research. And when I was kind of looking around, just kind of thinking, you know, how do I put this into some context? And so I did a quick internet search and looked for, you know, educational, you know, top ideas in educational research or whatever. And what was interesting is that I came up just with a list of 10 most significant education studies in 2020. And when I looked at those, it's pretty clear that they're all about the mechanics of learning. So the success of learning, the mechanics of learning, what helps students to do better, perform better, all these kinds of things. So it's certainly the case that there's a huge amount of literature looking at those kinds of aspects of education. But it's also important, I think, there's also huge literature, of course, looking at the importance of identity formation as education as an identity formation process. So it's not just about learning particular material, you know, learning skills, all those kinds of things. But in fact, it's part of a process of identity formation that will set people up for their life in society and so forth. There's a number of education theories that kind of emphasize that side of things, I guess. So I wanted to kind of put us a little bit into context there. Because what we are certainly embedded in that area of education research that relates to identity formation and transformations and so forth. That's pretty clear, I think, in terms of the title and the kinds of things that I'm talking about. But we're also interested in how that impacts upon the actual learning processes that are going on in the classrooms, in the lecture theatres, on the campus. So how are the ways in which those identity-related issues can either improve processes of learning or undermine them? So those are we're sort of looking at that kind of crossover between those two domains. I don't know why this is, there we go. I wanted just to talk a little bit about some meta theory, because one of the things that I think is also true in education is that there are a vast number of identity theories. So many different people at different times have put forward views in terms of what is the nature of human identity and how does education interact with that process. And so if you look at, for example, the Ericksonian perspective, it's very much a developmental theory, looking at how an individual's identity develops over time and how education impacts upon that. But I also particularly want to kind of explicitly mention the post-structuralist kind of approach to identity, which emphasizes the very much dynamic and constructed nature of identity, but also eschews the kind of psychological, some psychological explanations for those things, preferring to focus on discourses and things like that. So our work is informed by this, what we call the social identity approach, which consists really of two broad theoretical descriptions: social identity theory, or SIT, and self-categorization theory, or SCT. The idea here is that self-categorization theory really provides the underpinnings for social identity theory. So we talk about the social identity approach, and we usually talk in terms of social identity theory. But when we think in terms of how does that actually operate in the individual, and how does the self kind of manage that process, then we're talking about self-categorization theory. And the two together, it's very important to be able to focus on the two together. Because in fact, one of the things I wanted to kind of point out, particularly to those of you who perhaps take a bit more post-structuralist kind of approach, or various other kind of sociological approaches to identity, is that in fact SIT and SCT were born from a common spirit of critique, right, of more individualist psychological theories. So early psychological theories tended to emphasize the individual self, and very much see the social as something external to that, imposed upon the individual self. Whereas there are a number of critiques of that. And so, for example, Bloom's critique of the problem with that individualistic kind of approach helped in the development of social interactionism in sociology. And then, of course, the post-structuralist critique, also very important in terms of moving away from that individualist kind of account of identity. So I wanted to make the point that social identity and self-categorization theory are also part of that critique. So the social identity approach embraces a social, contextual, and dynamic view of the self that's broadly shared with these and other similar perspectives, right? So there's a lot of common ground, I guess, I wanted to establish with regard to that. So there is a lot of common ground, but as a social psychological theory, it also still embraces the concept of mental processes. So we're embedded in, so even though we kind of reject that kind of very individualistic view, we're still embedded within a sort of psychological framework in which we embrace mental processes. And so our interest becomes, in that sense, one of our interests becomes, how do those mental processes enable that kind of dynamic, flexible, socially shared understanding of self. And so in particular, in one of the chapters in the book that we talk about, was kind of a collaboration between myself and my sister, who's passed away now, but my sister, who is in fact a post-structuralist pedagogy person, and a colleague of hers, where we had many arguments and discussions over a period of time about trying to understand each other's perspective on the nature of the self. So it's very much born out of attempting to talk across the gaps in those silos of conversation. So I think there's grounds there for us to have conversations between those silos, shared by that understanding of self as a flexible, dynamic idea, and also the idea of self as being both personal and social. So that the personal self is only part of the process. That in fact the personal and the social are equally important to the self. So I wanted to kind of set the scene with that kind of meta theory, which might just then help, because a lot of the methods that we use, we do a lot of survey research, we do a lot of experiments, we also do some qualitative research, but the research that I'm presenting to you today is mostly survey-based research and a couple of experiments. So it can be easy from that to misunderstand our kind of meta theory. And so I wanted to put that up front as we have that discussion. And we've particularly also focused in some of our work on the idea of academic or discipline-based social identities in education. So often some people talk a lot about the student identity, and one of the problems with the student identity is I think we find that a little bit too broad. So it's very easy to define the student identity in lots of different kinds of ways. We want it to be a little bit more specific, and also to focus on the identities that are particularly about people's identity changes. So people's chosen academic discipline or field of study clearly has identity implications for them in terms of their future aspirational identity changes and so forth, in a way that the student identity doesn't necessarily reflect. And so we kind of wanted to focus a little bit on that. So I've used G's 2000 typology to think a little bit about these elements. So in terms of these discipline-based identities, academic discipline or field of study identities, actually meets three of G's three of the four sort of typology elements here. They're institutional identities in the sense that academic institutions are structured around, often structured around those things. They're discourse-based identities because students often recognize this identity and talk about this identity as part of their negotiated identity change and so forth. And they're also affinity group identities because students often organize themselves around these discipline-based or field of study identities because in many cases, these people will be future colleagues or share future aspirations in terms of career and so forth. So those are a number of reasons why we focused on those identities. So I want to just move now to talking about some of our early work where we kind of established some of the key links here that we build upon, and in particular our linking between these academic discipline identities and deep and surface learning. And in this, I particularly want to note two collaborators who've been really part of this work from the beginning. So Professor Michael Plato actually at the ANU in some ways really started this line of work for us all collectively. He was quite interested in making this bridge between social identity and deep and surface learning, and engaged a number of us in some research projects looking at that. And so a number of us have sort of taken that and kind of moved from there and developed lots of interesting ideas from that kind of starting point. So I wanted to kind of recognize Michael's kind of primary interest in kicking off this line of work, and Lillian Smythe, who did her PhD with me at the Australian National University and is now a very productive colleague working in this line of work as well. So I wanted to particularly note their involvement. So the early kind of link we wanted to make was between this educational concept of deep and surface learning, which I'll talk briefly about to kind of elaborate a little bit on that, and the identity implications of that. So there's a number of people who started work on this, but we've drawn particularly on the work of Biggs and colleagues in terms of elaborating this idea of deep and surface learning. There are various scales and measures of these things and so forth, but the thing we want to focus on is these two kind of components, deep learning and surface learning. I'll talk a bit more about what these things are in a moment when we look at some of the questions we use to actually ask about them. But what's particularly important, again, from a sort of meta theory point of view, is that these are not learning styles. So these are not individual differences. These are not things where we kind of can label students as having these things, right? We're not interested in labeling students as belonging to these particular things. These are approaches that are applied in a particular context. So students take an approach, and so that's the approach language is quite important here. They take a particular approach to learning in a particular context, at a particular time and for a particular purpose. So it's very much a kind of contextual approach that students might have. Now, they may have a broad trend to want to use more of one kind of learning than another, and of course that can still be the case. But we're not assuming that this is something that goes with the student. We're assuming that this is something that's an interaction between the student and their approach in a particular context. And so theoretically, that works well with our kind of understanding of self as being fluid and dynamic, because it means that in one context where a student does feel there's a strong identity connection, they may well engage in more deep learning, which we argue has a stronger identity implication. In another context, they may take a very utilitarian approach to learning, take a more surface learning approach, because they don't feel that it has a kind of identity implication for them. They're just trying to pass an exam or get through a phase of something, and so it doesn't necessarily have the same identity focus. So that's why that works well for us. The students can make contextual choices in terms of how they might approach these things. So to give you just a sort of a general, because I want to focus today more on the general ideas and concepts rather than getting too much into the nitty-gritty of the actual methods and the studies. A number of these studies are already published, and you can ask me about the mechanics afterwards if you want, but I want to sort of focus on the ideas as much as possible. But just to give you a general methodological background, so for simplicity, we generally use a sort of 5-item scale to capture discipline, social identity. And so that includes items like being a student in psychology is important to me. You know, I have lots of friends in medicine or whatever. So we generally try these days, because we can, because the technology allows us, we try and actually incorporate the actual name of their chosen area in the items to kind of make it a bit more salient for them. So whatever they've indicated is their area of study, we try and embed that into the actual item. So that's identification. And then we talk about deep and surface learning. There are longer scales for these things. We tend to sort of use shorter scales in order to be able to ask more different kinds of things. So rather than just having a simple study with long scales, we tend to use shorter scales and have more different kinds of things in them. So we often use 6-item scales for these things. And so a deep learning might be something like, I find most new topics interesting and often spend extra time trying to obtain more information about them. So it reflects a kind of engagement with the material and with the intention of the instructor, and so forth. Whereas for surface learning, I only study seriously what's given out in class or in the course outlines. So only doing what in a sense is on the surface level requirements, rather than digging deeper into the extra readings or the extra materials and so forth. So that's the broad thrust of the difference between the two. There are some subtleties, but for the purpose of the story today, it's sufficient. That broad thrush is sufficient. We also explored peer norms for these things. So this is something that's not really been explored before. So we would ask essentially statements like, most students in my field prefer to, for example, focus on understanding content fully and integrating new information with what they already know, which might be a deep-oriented norm, or a surface norm might be, most students in my field of study only learn what they need to learn and not worry too much about extra information. So we're interested in hearing not just what they do, but what they perceive their peers are more likely to do. And so we're interested in that kind of normative background. So when we, again, just to give a bit of a history here, Anna Maria Bliok did some preliminary work looking at the link between identity and deep learning, particularly in 2011. Anna Maria actually also comes from the Australian National University. So Anna Maria was part of our group at the ANU, part of our social psychology group there. And she went on to the University of Sydney, where she did this work that was published in 2011. So she's also part of that extended group from Australia. And she did some work there with some education colleagues, where they demonstrated this initial link between people's social identity in psychology or in economics or history or whatever it might be, and their use of deep learning, right? And they also established a link to academic results, to grades. Michael Plato and myself and Diana Grace in 2013 ran a small longitudinal study with first-year psychology cohorts. It was a small study because we only had it was longitudinal, and it was based on our own single cohort, year one cohort. So it was somewhat limited in size. But what we showed from that, whoops, hang on, I've lost control here. How do I go back? Normally I'd use arrows for this, but the arrow keys are not behaving in the right way for some reason. So apologies for that. So in that study, we showed correlational links between identity and deep learning, but not surface learning. So this is kind of, in a sense, what we're expecting. So we're expecting identity to be related to deep learning, because deep learning has a kind of identity implication. If we want to become part of the discipline of psychology, then we need to really embrace it and deeply investigate that and fully understand what that means. Whereas if we're just studying psychology for the sake of passing an exam, which allows us to pursue something else, then we may be less engaged in getting those extra information. So that's a very simple idea that's at the heart here, is that deep learning has identity implications. And that the desire to engage with that identity is more likely to motivate us to engage deeply in the topic area. So it's a fairly straightforward idea, right? It's a fairly straightforward idea, but it's important to kind of establish that link that we can then build on. We also showed longitudinally that there was a link from deep learning in semester 1 via their grades in semester 1 to identity in semester 2. So we can at least see some of the dynamic process going on here, where they engaged in study which gave them a better grade, and as a result of that better grade, they then thought, okay, I must be good at this. So that increased their identification. So there's clearly a kind of dynamic process going on here, where identity encourages deep learning. Deep learning hopefully increases performance. And higher performance then reinforces those identities. So there's clearly a dynamic process, and we're just sort of taking slices through that process, trying to understand how that's going on. So I'll come back to that time factor, briefly in a moment for a different study. For Lillian Smythe's PhD, the main thing we wanted to focus on actually was adding to this the idea of peer norms. Because it was very important for us to establish that if this is really a social process, if what we're asking in our questionnaires is really capturing a real social process going on underneath, that one way to see this really clearly would be in the operation of peer norms. So if we could see the impact of how people actually perceived their peers, their student peers, and their view, if we could see how that was impacting, then that would reinforce this notion that this was a sort of not just an individualistic exercise, but in fact did involve a sort of social process with the class, with the cohort. And so we looked at we did a number of studies where we looked at normative links. And so this 2015 paper was where we first really established this. And the key pattern is this interaction graph you can see here on the right. So the idea here is that when identification is low, right, the dotted line, there's not really a huge impact of peer norms on whether or not you're more likely to engage in deep learning, right? So this is for deep learning outcomes. The role of peer norms is fairly small and in fact not significant if you're low in identification yourself. But if you're high in identification, if being a student in whatever your field is important to you, then what that shows is that you're also paying attention to what your peers think. So if your peers think that engaging in deep learning is actually important, then you'll also engage in a high level of deep learning. All right. So now we don't know the causal order here, and again, I'll come back to that in a minute in terms of what comes first. We think, but the key thing is that what works together here, the highest level of report of deep learning, is where students both identify with their field of study, and it's supported by peer norms that also suggest that that's the right thing to do. Yeah, if either of those things is not in place, then we see a much lower level of deep learning. So if they're not engaged themselves, or if they actually, even if they're highly engaged, but they don't think there's a sort of peer support for the idea of engaging in deep learning, then they're less likely to. You can imagine this kind of social influence going on in there are some modules, some individual modules, some courses where in fact deep learning is not the point. So one might take an example of an anatomy class, for example, or perhaps an introductory law class or something like that, where in fact the focus of the class is actually really surface learning, right? You just have to learn a bunch of stuff by rote, more or less, in order to then later on build on it. But for the particular purposes of that class, actually just memorizing the key elements actually is quite important. So in that case, you might find that the norms in fact support a more surface approach rather than deep approach for the purposes of getting through that, doing well in that particular module. So again, you can see the contextual importance of why in certain contexts is not always the case that deep learning is likely to be the most supported approach to learning. I won't take you through this very complicated diagram at the bottom here, but I just wanted to show in the context of this this kind of more complex process. What we've got here is the deep learning norms, discipline identification, and also surface learning norms. And so here we can actually see that where the arrow points at the line, this is a moderation effect like you see in the graph above. So deep learning norms impacts upon the link between discipline identification and deep learning. So that's what that little arrow there is saying, that we've got this kind of impact here. But this arrow here is also saying that in fact, the more there are surface learning norms, that also can undermine the deep learning link, right? So so you can have deep learning norms which support it, but you can also have surface learning norms which can undermine that process. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this diagram is that it also links through to perceived teaching quality. So this is one of the things we also consistently find, is that people, generally speaking, people who identify more with their discipline also like the teachers and enjoy their teaching more. That's not too surprising, but it's kind of a useful thing to know. But it's also interesting to know that, for example, surface learning norms from amongst students can actually undermine that pathway, and therefore undermine perceptions of teaching quality. So those of us who teach in higher education very much bound by, and impacted by student ratings of our teaching performance and so forth. And so it's interesting to reflect on the fact that not only is the learning better with deep learning, but students who identify and engage in deep learning are more likely to reward us for our teaching. Those who engage in surface learning are more likely to undermine that and evaluate us not so positively in that regard. And the other thing I'll just point out here is this notion of intention to continue. So students are more likely to intend to continue in the discipline if they identify and engage in deep learning, and less so if they engage in surface learning. So there's just some extra stuff related to that model. So so what we wanted so this little particular thing is just a kind of attempt by us to in fact bring together, sorry, I've accidentally gone too far there again, let's go back, is to bring together the work actually done by Anna Maria Bliuch, which showed a link through to grades. This earlier work that we'd done hadn't had a link all the way through to academic outcomes. It was just looking at deep and service learning, intention to continue, etc., but didn't go all the way through to grades. So we wanted to show that these effects do carry all the way through to actual performance measures. And so that's what this little study was about. And so what we do find from a study based on 350 university students across 12 different modules that they're studying a number of different topics, what we find is the combination of these two sets of things that we've been looking at. So first of all, we find that identification does impact upon people's learning approach, increases deep learning, and that does in fact improve grades, right? So the link through deep learning does actually, it's not just a student self-report thing, it does actually lead to improved grades as well. And here, this normative effect says that that impact that we were just talking about, where peer norms impacts upon whether students more likely to engage in deep learning, also carries through to the impact in terms of performance. So that suggests that not only the individual engaging with their discipline, but their perception of their peers' normative approach and so forth can carry through in terms of impact upon their actual performance in the module. And so we actually see that interaction that we talked about on the previous slide is actually mediated through to the actual performance. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of point that out. We've also done some work, but I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but I think it's kind of an interesting area that we want to explore a bit more. That peers are not the only source of potential normative influence, because instructors are, of course, constantly trying to influence students' approach to learning. So we're constantly trying to encourage students to engage in the kind of learning we want them to engage in. When Biggs talked about this, they talk about this as constructive alignment. So the Biggs idea of constructive alignment is that if you want to encourage students to engage in deep learning, then what you need to do is design your assessment to require them to do deep learning. So if they need to engage in deeply with the material in order to complete the assessment, then you're kind of, in a sense, encouraging them to do that. I guess if you want them to do deep learning, but then assess the module based upon just really surface knowledge, and don't actually capture that deeper engagement in the assessment, then in a sense you're undermining the tendency towards deep learning. So Biggs kind of calls this constructive alignment, and sees it as a sort of a practical element of teaching. But we agree with that, but we actually see this as really psychologically as a kind of another form of influence, right? So the instructor is trying to influence students to engage in the kind of learning they want by constructing the exercises and the assessment that they engage in to reinforce the kind of learning that they want to reinforce. So we see this as another kind of normative influence, essentially. And so what we were interested in, and what we're still interested in, we want to do some more work on this, is what happens when the peer norms and the instructor norms are out of sync, right? So what happens if the instructor really wants in deep learning, but the peer norms are for surface learning? What happens in that kind of setting, and what are the things which make the instructor norms more potent? What are the things that make the peer norms more potent in that process? So there's some interesting research that we want to do to follow up on that kind of idea of instructor norms as well as peer norms. And of course, tutor norms are important as well, because I think part of what makes this interesting from an identity point of view is whether the students see the instructor as in group or not. So do they see the instructor? Do they see that influence from the instructor as an in-group influence attempt or an out-group influence attempt? And we know from the social psychological literature that impacts differently on how people will respond to that. You would hope that they would be seen as an in-group in the sense that they represent a senior member of the discipline you're aspiring to be part of. But if you're not really engaged, then you might see them as out-group. And then also, like tutors who might be graduate students, for example, they're still students in a way, but they're also staff. So they're kind of in between. And so what becomes interesting then is how are they seen? Are they seen as representing, as being students who have got through this process and can be helpful, or are they seen as kind of outside of that experience influence? So there's I think a lot of interesting kind of stuff that can be explored in terms of that idea. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about this. I mentioned before, one of the things we don't know is what comes first, because we know that, and what it means in any case, we know that identity is going to relate to deep learning. We know that deep learning is likely to relate to identity, perhaps mediated through academic performance. So we wanted to kind of get a bit of a sense, though, at the beginning of somebody's university career, what is more important, because this has implications for what we might do to intervene and kind of reinforce the right things. So we did a study where we actually had two phases. The first phase was more or less as soon as people arrive. It was like in the first week they were on campus, and then later in the first semester. And we looked at both identification and deep learning and various other things during those two phases. So what we're interested in is what would impact across time. And you can see here that what we find is that, deep learning, so everything at time one, of course, influences at time two. So there's a consistency across time. But the key point here is that discipline social identification has an impact upon both deep learning norms and deep learning approach at time two, whereas those two things don't have an impact upon discipline social identification at time two, right? So the influence from time one to time two, right, is mostly coming out of the identification rather than the deep learning. So what that suggests is that when they first arrive, it's the identification that's the key to start the virtuous cycle. So they identify more, they engage in a deeper learning, and that hopefully helps them to do well and then reinforces their identity and so forth. So the virtuous cycle of engagement sort of starts with the identification rather than deep learning. Later on, of course, it becomes then part of that cycle. So more deep learning helps them do better and increases their identity. But right at the beginning, it's the identity. So that I'm not going to talk about it today because I'm going to run out of time, but this relates to how we might intervene in the early stages when people first arrive to help them kind of get in that correct virtuous cycle of engagement. That starting with the identity is key. Okay, so I'm going to move quickly through a couple of other things that we've been exploring. We wanted to look at transitions to university and how when people are transitioning to university, particularly those who perhaps come from non-traditional backgrounds and so forth, how this might undermine identity. And so that's the key thing that really I just want to get from this slide is that, so this study by Yetten and colleagues was actually about social class, and the implication here is that if they were essentially working class students, then they experienced a kind of incompatibility when they first arrived at university, and that incompatibility undermined their identification at subsequent time points. And then actually that therefore then undermined a sense of social mobility. So So, so if we see university education as being part of a exercise of social mobility for some people, then what can happen is that this sense of identity incompatibility can undermine those processes that lead to that. So we wanted to explore that a little bit more, and we wanted to think about how that might actually work within the context of the higher education processes. So in this previous study, it was just really in terms of their expectations. And we know that there are issues with attainment gaps for various social groups in terms of higher education. So those that can most benefit, perhaps in terms of social mobility from higher education, there are still established gaps in their final, outcomes from higher education that sort of undermine that process. And we wanted to understand what that might be kind of bringing that about. So we looked at some work that was done on what's called self-worth protection strategies. And so the interesting point here that we just want to draw upon is that things like self-handicapping and procrastination might, and particularly something like procrastination, which we might see as purely an academic skills thing, actually has identity implications. And so that's really the key point of this slide. I'm just going to skip over, but that's the main point I wanted to get across here, is that a number of these strategies, which we might see as mechanistic strategies, actually have identity implications. So we did this study where we looked at academic identity, but also incompatibility and how that impacted on deep and service learning, but also on what we call here these performance undermining outcomes, right? Things that might make life worse for people in terms of education. I'm going to talk about it very briefly, but the key thing here is self-handicapping. For example, some students purposely don't apply themselves at university so that if they don't do well, they can say it's because they didn't try. Right, so that's an explicit self-handicapping item, but also procrastination. Tests are meant to be studied for just the night before, and I usually allocate time, I usually allocate time to review and proofread my work. That's reverse scored. So procrastination capturing more directly whether people, kind of leave it to the last minute or not. And then our identity incompatibility scale was this notion, I sometimes feel like an outsider at my university due to factors I can't change, like where I came from or the kind of education my family have had. Or I sometimes feel as though the identity I want to project at university is very different to the one I want to project back home. So we were trying to capture this notion that the identity back home kind of feels different to the identity on campus, and that there's a kind of clash between those two identities. We deliberately didn't specifically mention any particular group here. So our goal here was to capture the psychological experience of that disconnect or incompatibility without it necessarily being based on any particular quality, right? So it could be based on ethnicity, it could be based on class, but it could be based on any number of other factors. So we were more interested in the psychological experience than the particular sociological characteristics that went with that. The key thing to point out here is that interestingly, academic social identity, or discipline social identity, and identity incompatibility were largely unrelated. So the small negative thing here, but it's not significant. So they're largely unrelated elements, and that's interesting, right? Because it means that we might be able to use one to kind of compensate for the other. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. So academic social identity predicts deep learning and reduces service learning. That's the same as what we found previously. Identity incompatibility increases surface learning. And then in terms of when we see the flow through of that to these undermining behaviors, that surface learning increases the likelihood of procrastination. It also increases the likelihood of self-handicapping. And that identity incompatibility also directly increases the likelihood of procrastination and self-handicapping. So in addition to this kind of pathway through a kind of surface learning sort of disengagement in the topic, right, we also have an independent effect of this disconnect in terms of identity on these outcomes. But there's a nice pathway here, which is a sort of compensatory pathway where engaging in the identity increases deep learning, which actually then reduces the likelihood of procrastination. So if you're engaged in the topic, you're less likely to procrastinate on average. I'm running a bit short of time, so I'm just going to skip the details of this study and just point out some interesting things from it. So this was actually a replication of the same idea, but done with international students. So it was just done specifically on international students. We find more or less the same overall pattern. There's a few pathways missing that were just not strong enough to be significant, but broadly the same pattern holds. But the important thing I wanted to point out about from this study is this interaction. So we in this particular study, we found this really nice interaction where if their academic discipline identity is low, right, then we definitely see this negative pattern where high incompatibility leads to higher procrastination. But that pattern disappears if their discipline identity is high, right? So if we can get them to engage in their discipline, then actually we can reduce the impact of that sense of incompatibility on procrastination. So it's interesting, particularly that this came through for international students who are likely to be particularly vulnerable to that sense of being disconnected, but also who won't necessarily start with as high a sense of engagement with their discipline necessarily. So what this suggests is that at least for this group, there's a good opportunity for intervention here, right? That if the international students can be helped to engage with their school, with their discipline as early as possible in their experience, then that hopefully might reduce the impact of that sense of identity disconnect in terms of how it leads to the negative outcomes. I'm just going to make one more little kind of point here, and then just talk about, oops, hang on, we've gone backwards. There we go. And then just talk about some broad things, and then hand over to some questions. So I'm going to skip over some of the details again of this, but just get to the sort of the bottom line as quickly as I can. So we were interested to see whether some of these things would also apply to this new notion of assessment feedback literacy. So the key concept here is that is how students deal with feedback, right? So we know as teachers in higher education have this common experience that we put a lot of time and effort into writing feedback for students. And in many cases, the students actually don't engage with that feedback. So they may not even read it at all, right? So institutionally, we're required to offer lots of feedback, but students may or may not actually take up that feedback, may not even read it. Even if they read it, they might choose to ignore it. And so that seems like a lot of wasteful energy and effort, right, that we sort of potentially engage in. And so it seemed to me that there's this kind of interest at the moment on how we can get students to engage more productively with feedback. So what do we as instructors do differently to kind of make feedback more engageable with, but also how can we help students to develop a sort of a literacy for how best to engage with feedback. And it struck me that in fact there's a lot of similarities here between this and the deep and service learning idea, right? That the equivalent of deep learning in terms of engaging with the content is engaging with the feedback. So engaging with feedback is another form of engaging with content, if you like. And feedback avoidance is another way of like a skimming across without having to fully engage. So it seemed to be very similar in concept to sort of a deep and service learning thing, and therefore something that we could also perhaps predict. So we ran a study particularly comparing individual difference approaches to a kind of more social approach here. So we looked at a study done by Naomi Winston colleagues where they looked at some personality level factors and some other individual difference factors and how that impacted upon people's feedback use. I'm going to skip over the main issue there. They included conscientiousness and some personality stuff, and then a number of scales. But the key, I want to just get to the main results really, and just get you to the headline of it. We developed a measure for our study which factored into two factors, so feedback avoidance and feedback engagement. So that was kind of interesting that came up as two different things. You might think that it would just be one thing, right? You either avoid or engage, but actually there's elements that were kind of independent. So, you know, you might, you know, partly engage and still ignore it, you know, so there's various combinations of those things that you might kind of involve your responses. The key point here is that what we found is that social identity predicted feedback avoidance in a negative sense over and above the individual difference approaches. So that's really just the headline point here for the purposes of the talk today, right, is that over and above kind of personality things like conscientious and neuroticism, and over and above a kind of individual and indifference approach to mastery, that the social identity kind of reduced avoidance over and above those individual difference factors. With feedback engagement, social identity didn't directly increase feedback engagement, but peer norms did. Right, so if you perceive that your peers are engaging with feedback, you're more likely to engage with feedback. So there's some broader points there we can come back to in discussion. I'm going to sort of keep that short for now. So I just want to give you a bit of a sense as to other things we're doing now, so that you can ask about these things if you're interested in the discussion. So we're kind of extending the social mobility, widening participation work to look at the belonging literature. So there's a whole literature on belonging interventions for students in transition. So Greg Walton from Stanford and some of his colleagues have done an enormous amount of work looking at how to help students feel they belong. And belonging is clearly related to our idea of identity and compatibility. But we believe that belonging and identification are still nonetheless two distinct constructs. So they're going to be closely related, but we think that some things psychologically we can better understand in terms of identity versus belonging. So one of the things we're kind of trying to do at the moment is kind of tease apart these ideas of belonging versus identification and see whether that leads us to some useful implications for interventions and so forth. We've done some stuff looking at organizational identification and how that compares. And the quick take-home message there is that discipline identification has many more impacts on educationally useful things than organizational identification does. So it seems, I guess what I'm saying there is that discipline or academic field of study identification, as far as education processes, seems to hit the sweet spot where it's specific enough to look at what, you know, students' engagement in learning behavior, whereas organizational identification does predict certain things like their satisfaction with their overall degree, but not necessarily their individual learning behaviors and so forth, right? So we find organizational identification to be important, but not as important as the discipline identification. And we're also interested in why people choose their field of study and how we can understand different reasons for choosing their field of study. And the reason for asking that question particularly relates to the kind of political arguments over neoliberal approaches to higher education, which kind of tend to assume that students' motivations for field of study is very utilitarian. So that's based on the assumption that, you know, we can charge, in the UK context at least, you know, we can charge more fees for degrees that lead to higher salaries afterwards and those kinds of, so there's an assumption that there's a kind of utilitarian link to people's choices of discipline. And in fact, our preliminary results really contrast against that and argue that students actually are not, on the whole, choosing their field of study based upon those kind of neoliberal kind of assumptions, but in fact is very much about self-development and self-enhancement, self-development, but not just at the individual level, but at the social level. So career choice literatures often really focus on the individual choices to succeed individually. But what's clear from the work, the preliminary work we've done, is that what students see as being a successful life is not just higher status and higher income and that sort of stuff, but actually being part of something, being part of a discipline, being part of a career path, being part of society generally, you know, helping to build society and to have an important role in society. All of these things are important to their identity as well. So, so I think there's interesting some lines of research that we want to do for that purpose. And of course, links to well-being as well. So I note a bunch of collaborators there at the bottom of that slide. There's a bunch of people in different schools and so forth that are kind of working on some of this now. So just to finish with some implications, a key thing is that student performance should not just be seen as an individual mechanism, right? That students are not just there to individually improve in terms of their learning and outcomes, but they also see themselves very much as part of a social collective exercise in terms of aspiring to be part of a discipline, but they're also part of a cohort, they're part of a group of students who are studying similar things, etc. And that some of those social elements need to be kind of unpacked and brought to the fore a little bit for us to understand how to intervene in certain ways to kind of improve those experiences for people. And that those normative elements are quite important. So actually remembering the importance of peer norms in terms of our education processes. We often ignore, I think, that issue of peer norms in terms of academic staff development, in terms of, you know, how we can improve our teaching and all that kind of stuff. We often just don't talk about the issue of student peer norms and how we might impact upon that or take that into account. We've shown this already for deep learning and starting to show this also for feedback literacy. Whoops, that way. Yeah, and so I'll stop there. Sorry, I've got a few minutes over, but I'll stop there and open up for some questions. Hopefully we'll have a good discussion. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you very much. I hope that you're not too exhausted before we take some questions. There are questions coming in through the chat, so I'll start reading them so you have some time to think about this. So first question comes from Marizan. And was there any link between deep learning, discipline interest, and how students made the choice of the discipline they want to explore? For example, a student who decides the field of study for him herself without parental pressure or influence. Would deep learning be evident for students who might be forced into a particular discipline by their parents or social expectations?
This is a really terrific question, and is really kind of one of the next things we want to kind of explore. So we've just done a preliminary study where what we've looked at is the reasons that people chose their discipline and then the impact that that would have on their engagement, on their identification with the discipline. And we have included in that deep and surface learning and procrastination. So I can speak to this a little bit, but it's something we kind of want to explore. So the first thing we find is that there's kind of two kind of main pathways we find actually. So one pathway is a kind of utilitarian pathway. So we might find that some people have, for example, high social mobility motives, might be more likely to take a utilitarian approach to their choice. And that's actually more likely to lead to surface learning. And then the consequences of surface learning. So they're more likely to engage in those undermining behaviors, which is the kind of thing you're kind of talking about in the question. And then the other pathway is the kind of self-development, self-enhancement pathway. Interesting, also predicted by social mobility motives. So people who are people who are motivated to use university to kind of improve their social standing, in a sense, also they don't just take a utilitarian approach. They also take this kind of more social, personal social meaning identity approach. So they're more likely to answer positively towards questions about not only enhancing themselves, in terms of developing themselves into a career, but also being part of society and the importance of actually making a contribution to society. Those people are more likely to be engaged in their discipline of study, more likely to engage, therefore, in deep learning, and then all the other things we've talked about kind of carry forward from there. So absolutely, this definitely is an interesting thing that we want to kind of explore. In terms of parental influence, we did include items on this, but parental influence, so at the moment, our analysis has been, if you like, just kind of these main effect sort of pathway processes. Parental impact, parental and friends sort of impact tends to be a kind of moderating impact. So makes it more or less likely that people will engage rather, relatively. So what we find, for example, is that as part of that study, we asked them what their, in a sense, second choice would have been. So what was the alternative they were considering rather than the choice that they actually took. And what we found there is we did find some influence of parents and friends in that if parents and friends kind of supported that, then the relationship between between kind of their personal interest and their choice of discipline was weaker, right? So normally there's a strong personal interest deciding which of those alternatives they ended up choosing. But if the parental influence was there, that sort of undermined slightly the sort of the personal influence aspect. So I think parental influence does have that kind of impact, and it does reduce that. And by reducing it based upon interests, it's likely to. So that's what we haven't seen. We haven't looked at that specific question that you raised in terms of whether the parental influence would then undermine those further down the line links to deep and service learning. We can't specifically address that question from the data that we have, but from what we've got, I would say yes, there's a strong likelihood of that, and that's one of the things we kind of want to follow up and explore. So hopefully that helps. I think you're on the right track there. I think there's quite likely to be the dynamic that's going on there.
Thank you very much. And there are more questions coming in. I think we still have some time for those. So the next question is from Jonathan. Hi, Ken. I'd be interested to know what the implications might be for the student induction process. For instance, like short courses that aim to teach study habits to new students at the start of their degree.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you. Thanks for coming along. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the studies that we did, which I didn't talk about, was a collaboration with our kind of student development section. So we've been working with them for a while to kind of look at this issue of what can we do in the first year to kind of make this process work well. So what they had already done, in fact, was they already had an initiative that was started by postgraduate students, where postgrads in a particular school would actually run courses in the first semester of first year for new students and teach them how to be a good student in their discipline. So when I arrived at St Andrews, I was really interested. This has just been going on for a little while. And I was really interested in this because it seemed to me to perfectly fit what we would predict would be a good intervention, right? Because it was run by students who are kind of in-group members, like they're kind of, the sort of high status in-group members as successful students. But also it's school specific. So they were teaching them how to be good students in history, or how to be good students in psychology, or how to be good students in medicine. And so that also would kind of reinforce this idea of the kind of the discipline identity as kind of being the based on that. So we did some evaluation of this, and we did in fact find that this kind of intervention was likely to increase their engagement with that school identity. So we're doing some more follow-up with them, but that's certainly the case. I think, you know, some sort of intervention along those lines is likely to be very helpful. We're also working with them on some sort of more other induction processes and trying to find other, so particularly with like the belonging intervention stuff, that's one of the things we're exploring also, is how do we take some of the benefits that we see in the literature in the belonging interventions and see how much that's about identity, and because the traditional interventions very much assume certain kind of obvious identity qualities, right? More sort of sociological identity. So it's oriented towards helping people of color or people from working class backgrounds or non-traditional students backgrounds, etc., to feel more comfortable and to fit in. But our approach, I guess, is to look at the psychological experience more than the kind of the group experience, if you like. And so we want to kind of see how that might also be adapted in terms of identities and so forth. So I think there's a lot more to be done there, but absolutely in that first induction process is where there might be several opportunities for intervention. Absolutely.
Thank you very much for this answer. And then we have a next one. Thank you by Katarina. Also, thank you for a very interesting lecture. I'm interested in social identification as a process. Have you got any research outcomes in this view? Thank you very much. Or maybe some literature tips.
Yes. I mean, so the social identity literature is actually quite broad in terms of a whole bunch of different applications of these things. So in broad terms, it's been applied, you know, to health as well as to education and to collective action and social change, all these kinds of things. So there's actually quite a large literature on social identity change over time and so forth. Probably the easiest thing there might be, I mean, follow me up with an email or something, and you know, give me a bit more detail in terms of what you're looking for, and I can point you in the right direction. But yeah, there's actually quite a large literature on all these kinds of things. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And moving to a next question by Phineas, have you considered how informal, formal, and non-formal learning settings might link with this theoretical background?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a lot of potential to explore these kind of more contextual variables. You know, as I said at the beginning, I think one of the things that's really important about this approach is that both our understanding of self processes and our understanding of the learning approach processes is very much contextual. So whenever we do a study, we kind of take a slice at a particular level at a particular point in time. And that's kind of unfortunately a kind of consequence of the method. But so exactly these kind of questions you're asking, I think are important to look at, perhaps using a variety of different methods. So we might try and dig down a little bit in terms of the approach we might look at within a, so we've tended to look at this at a big picture scale, so across lots of disciplines and lots of different universities and so forth. But one of the benefits of perhaps taking a more local approach, working with sort of smaller number of disciplines in a local context, where keeping that sort of constant, if you like, might be then the opportunity to tease apart some of these other more informal processes within that. So holding constant the kind of organization and perhaps in the discipline. Are there sub elements within that where we can see these different informal processes operating? I think there's a lot of potential to explore that. So how for example, do within a class, so we've asked with norms, we've asked people what they individually think the norms of the discipline are, but of course there's likely to be multiple norms floating around, and so we expect they'll kind of give us the majority view. But there's likely to be sort of subcultures kind of floating around within the class, and how do those compete? How do those, because it's important to know that, because if we want to intervene and support the subculture that we want to reinforce, right, then we've got to know about how those processes work. So there's a lot of work in social identity theory approach on these kinds of things. So within a larger group, where there's subgroups, and how do the identities within the subgroups kind of operate together. So there's some broad literature on that tells us about what we might expect, how we might expect that to go. But to my knowledge, there's not a lot of literature in the education context to thinking like within a class, how do we manage these different kind of normative subgroups? I think there's a lot of room for interesting research around that.
I would just follow with a brief observation from our setting, because we are providing education to future teachers. And quite a lot of them are actually involved in some non-formal activities, you know, like leading a student clubs or sport teams. And that actually seems to be fueling their teacher identity. So actually, it seems that there might be a very interesting link and pathway to explore how these interact with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So thank you very much. And we have a next question by Magdalena. How would you characterize the relation between students' well-being and her social identity? I guess maybe this is very broad, but again, we'll welcome if you point us several directions.
Yeah. So I know a little bit more about this in the context of medical education, because roughly nearly 15 years ago now, I had a burst of time in a medical school working in medical education. And one of the first things that struck me as soon as I started working in that field was that there was this massive literature on the well-being of medical students in particular, and the stress of medical degrees and so forth. There's a massive literature on this in medical education. It follows all the way through to medical practitioners, but it starts in medical school. So there's a sort of an instant stress element to that, and implications for that. So one of the things that we were interested in was two competing theories of how kind of self-processes might operate here, because there's a sort of psychological approach which suggests that actually self-complexity can be a really good thing for managing stress. So if you've got a kind of very flexible kind of self-structure where you kind of get rewards from a number of different kind of processes, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, I guess, in terms of identity, that this can be good in terms of handling stress, because if you're stressed in one area, you can kind of get benefit from other areas. But then there's a kind of competing approach, I guess, which is that we also get well-being benefit from being really engaged with particular identities. And so in the medical school context, this is really obvious, this competition, right? Because, you know, you might take a very sort of general approach where you've got lots of complex identities and so forth, and particularly leading into medical school. To get into medical school, often what students do is that they'll want to boost their CV, so they'll get involved in lots of different kinds of activities in the process. But what happens is once you arrive at medical school, what becomes really clear is that the most common survival strategy is in fact to focus on the medical student identity and almost nothing else, right? And so one of the things that immediately happens when you start medical school, right, is that you actually, so I use the example of, so I'm involved in the dance scene. I'm a sort of Latin dancer. And one of the things when you're talking to dancing people who spend a lot of time dancing, they actually start to talk about non-dancing friends as a sort of a category, right? So there's actually a thing where it's like, well, how much time can we really spare for non-dancing friends? Right, because dancing becomes such a central identity thing. And I think it's like that for medical students, actually, is that they don't have time for people who aren't in medical school. You see this consistently right across. So I'm emphasizing this because the literature on this is really clear, right? That I think in the context of medical school, having a strong identity as a medical student is an important survival strategy for the bulk of people. Right, there are some that take the other strategy, but that most, I think, take that strategy. But whether or not that applies to other areas, I think, is still something that needs to be looked at. So there is definitely a well-being benefit that comes having strong identities, right? There's a whole literature on what's called the social cure. So this notion of having strong identities that we can rely upon actually clearly has well-being benefits. But in that same literature, there is a sense in which more of those identities is good, right? So there is this kind of, these two kind of competing views. Good for your well-being. In medical school, less so. There's no space for that. So I think there's room to explore this in the general education literature, because I think there'll be other disciplines that are like medicine, in that they really require you to buy in fully and completely into that experience. And then there'll be other disciplines where, in fact, it's a bit more fluid and a lot more crossover with other things. So I think, yeah, I think there are some interesting questions to be explored there in terms of what the best strategies are for identity and well-being.
Thank you very much. And I think there's still time if someone else wants to either post your question in chat or speak out. You can turn on your microphone and you can post your question in case there's still something else you want to learn about, or people are just, ready to go and do more reading.
I can maybe ask one other thing.
Yes, please.
Ken, yeah, just really interesting stuff. Quite interested in the idea of how students manage sort of different conflicting identities, because particularly in the early years of university, and I think this is true in a number of countries, they may be doing more than one subject. So they may be doing a kind of joint degree or have a major and a minor, that kind of thing. And is it just the case that we can kind of like a pie chart allocate, different ones have different weightings, or is it the case that perhaps people particularly go down one route and identify with that as their in-group?
So thanks, Jonathan. I think this is a really interesting question, and particularly relevant for St Andrews, actually, because St Andrews has a very strong joint degree program, and other universities will be similar. So some places tend to have kind of more homogeneous kind of degree programs, and others kind of really encourage this kind of mix and match and joint programs. So I think there's some really interesting research to be explored, perhaps cross-institutionally, in terms of some of these kinds of things. But my sense is that we've treated each of those identities as a thing in itself. So where, for example, we have joint majors, we kind of ask them both. We ask them about their kind of what we kind of ask them to say their main identity and then their second identity. But there's an opportunity for them to say they're committed to both. And so I think these things can act independently to some degree, as if they're really engaged with both, then they're likely to engage in deep learning in both and so forth. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be a competitive kind of thing, but in the sense that as the person was asking before, in terms of choices, I mean that choice is not just at the first year point, right? That for some of our students, that's sort of the second or third year choice, where they then focus in more, or they maintain a joint kind of degree program or whatever that might be. And so some of the same factors that might play into their initial choice of field of study or fields of study options will kind of take on board there again. So I think there is stuff there about, essentially what they're good at. Of course, those kinds of things also play into it, but then also how they see themselves in these different disciplines, contributing to society, being part of something larger than themselves and so forth. Again, I think these are things we sometimes get ignored in subject choice or career choice literatures. They're very much seen as individual, either personality or kind of simple, skills or whatever. I'm good at this, therefore I'll do this. And so I think actually in all of that literature, there's some benefit to kind of reflect upon this kind of social self, and to the extent to which students actually see this as an essential part. That's not just about their individual development, but actually their development into something that has a social meaning you know, in that process. So yeah, it's probably an incomplete answer, but hopefully, hopefully some interesting ideas we can talk about further, Jonathan. Yeah.
Definitely a big inspiration for us, because we tend to have like a double degrees in our school. So it's actually something to really take into account, whether there might be some competing norms within the different disciplines. Yes. I think that we are getting almost to the end, but we still have one more question by Daria. So I'm going to read it. Are there effective ways for higher education institutions to increase the perceived identity compatibility for all students by like structural changes, you know, instead of focusing on, instead of specific programs focusing on like non-traditional students?
Yeah, thank you. This is such a really important and key question. And it's one that I'm really struggling with because, as I say, I think some of the traditional interventions to do this are you know, are well-intentioned and effective, but inevitably by their nature, they focus on the perceiver, right? They focus on the student and helping the student to kind of feel that they fit in more. And I think when these things were first done, which is, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, when these kind of things were first established, and we've seen they've been effective over that period of time. But I think there's been a change in the kind of political culture of universities in that time, right? And I think rather, so 20 or 30 years ago, it would have been much more normative to kind of take the approach that students should fit in, right? That what we want to do is, in the nicest possible way, help students to feel that they fit in and belong and can succeed here and all those kinds of things. But I think now there's much more of an emphasis on, like, exactly as you say, what are the institutional things that, you know, what are those kind of factors that we can control that can help people to feel more part of the process, right, rather than them having to kind of make it. So I think you're absolutely right. This is a crucial thing that we need to be thinking very carefully about, and it's one of the reasons that we think that the sort of identity approach can help here, because it takes it away to some degree from the kind of just the physical sense of belonging to a place and that kind of stuff, and reminds us that actually there's important psychological identity processes at play, and that what goes into those, though, exactly as you say, is not just the individual level stuff, right? But it's the collective stuff, it's the institutional stuff. That's really important to remember in all of that. So that's actually something that we're looking in, that we want to try and find an answer to. So I think that's a really good question. Unfortunately, at the moment, I don't have a good answer to that question, but it's something that's really playing on our minds in terms of how we kind of approach these sorts of issues, because the examples out there are very much the kind of deliver the program to the students kind of approach, and so we're very much trying to think creatively about how other ways that we can kind of engage with that. So thanks for that question. It's a really good question. Yeah.
So I think that we are at the very end. Ken, thank you so much for like loads and loads of food for thought. I think that, you know, there are like so many ideas, and of course like links to other researches and literature and ideas for own researches and so on and so forth. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here with us. I hope that this was inspiring material for you, and you guys are going to follow on what's been said here. And I wish you all a very nice afternoon. And thank you again, Ken, for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much again for the invitation, and to you all, and for engaging in the discussion. Really great for me as well. So much terrific for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.